Do you have a roadmap that I can try? Cause I think I
No connection here. Okay, so we don't know. So let's get started. Okay, so maybe, yeah, just a few minutes late, but so it's a real pleasure for me to introduce Ricard Solé, coming from Barcelona, from the University Pompeu Fabra, a world expert since long ago in complex systems, complexity science, networks. What else?
Many things.
Statistical physics applied to biological systems and cognitive systems and languages and ecosystems and difficult to introduce you, Ricard. So many things. He's also associated with the famous Santa Fe Institute in the United States, and he's going to be speaking to us today about constraints. So the floor is yours. Okay. It's a real pleasure. I really thank you for coming. For us, it's a luxury to have you here. So let's see what comes out.
All right, thank you. The micro's working? Yep, okay. So thanks everyone to be here. So my talk is a very ambitious one. It has to do with some kind of more like a research program for understanding complexity and the fundamental level. And it connects with the problem of prediction. So what can be predicted? What can be actually set from theoretical frameworks? And of course, physics emerges as kind of our reference state for the most powerful prediction theories. I put a Laplace demon here. I guess most of you probably know about who the Laplace demon was, but just in case, Pierre-Simon de Laplace, on the wave of Newtonian theory and the very deterministic picture of the world, made this kind of statement that using Newtonian theory, in principle, you know that in principle means that it's not going to happen, right? But in principle, we can imagine a kind of a creature capable of determining the position and the velocity of every single particle in the universe. And if Newtonian theory works, then you just need to run the equations and you can know everything about the future. And you run back, you know everything about the past, right? So it's kind of an extreme, kind of deterministic view of the world. Of course, this kind of view, which is based on thinking in the building blocks, the minimal structures, and from there infer everything else, has been challenged in many ways, right? And in particular, in the context of complex systems, it has been challenged because we know there are emergent phenomena, right? That in the real world, many things cannot be explained at all by looking at the units on the lower scales, right? One of my favorite examples is the termite nest, right? You have this nest in Africa that have 4 meters tall, amazing ventilation systems, agriculture, all kinds of things you can imagine, right? You can spend your whole life looking at single termites, analyzing anything you can do. And you'll never understand how the nest is built because it's the result of collective intelligence, right? Individuals are blind, use simple chemical clues. It's nothing there, right? So you need really to go into a different scale and use a different model approach, which typically ignores a lot of the details, which goes totally against the usual reductionist picture. I put these 2 papers. I have several papers here just as a reference for you. One that was very influential from Phil Anderson. He made the point that even in physics, you can say, well, in physics, everything is like you build the equations and you say you can tell everything, right? But even in physics, that's not true, right? There's many things that cannot be inferred from microscopic rules, right? And this is a very interesting paper also. The name might be confusing because it's kind of a sarcasm, right? The theory of everything. Is that really possible, a theory of everything? This is David Pines, who was one of the founder fathers of the Santa Fe Institute. As a little story, I shared office with him several times. Very interesting person. And when he was a young physicist, he was hired by Robert Oppenheimer. And so many stories to tell. And in this paper, they actually made the point that in physics, I don't know, how many physicists are here? One. Okay. So in physics, you have these very powerful theoretical frameworks, so you can actually build a function, an energy function that it should capture everything from a system, like the microscopic interactions. But what people don't tell typically is that you take this, you have 10 particles, and you run into trouble, right? It's very difficult to say something really relevant, right? Surprisingly, okay. So this talk is about, the big reference here is this paper. This is something I've been stumbling over the years. At some point, I was at the Santa Fe Institute, and there was a bunch of really smart people. And I said, I thought it was a good idea to put them together in a room and tell about what was my idea, and ask them to join forces, right? If you think like that sometime, think twice, okay? So, because it's very smart people with a lot of personality. So the paper, which you can find out, is a thick paper that involves a lot of stuff, right? And so much that even in an hour talk and going fast, I can only touch some of the stories, right? So I'm not going to go into everything. These are figures that are in the paper. At some point, the paper was really thick. We went beyond the limits of the maximum size, and then one of the reviewers said, "You haven't put development here," which I wanted, and so I told the editor, "Can we add more pages?" And he said, "Okay," right? And then at some point I thought, but this language is not there. I'm going to talk about that. So I was thinking, asking the editor, can I also put something up? I said, let's not having them an embolism. And so the paper starts with this. Let me put this in the context. Why these fundamental constraints? You see, the title is very modest, right? Fundamental constraints of the logic of living systems. Imagine a space-proof lands on a distant planet. Why we start with that? Because in the end, the paper wants to present a kind of a general view, and a very strong view, okay, about what is possible in biology. If you have an alternative biosphere where life develops, is anything we can say about what to expect, right? This is a big debate now, particularly in astrobiology, but it's been there, as you know, for many years. Whether there are universal laws, but we're going to find out something somewhere else completely alien, so not describable with our understanding of biology. I'm going to argue against that, right? I'm going to argue that there are things that are probably really fundamentally universal, right, at the logic level. But it also affects another domain of research that is very active now. In my own lab, we have a wet lab also. We are theoreticians, but we have a wet lab, where we use synthetic biology to actually interrogate complex systems. So what can we do by building in the lab using living systems? So it's again the same thing. What are the limits? Right? Is everything possible? Can I engineer wherever I want? Okay. So that, of course, connects what I'm going to talk about with things that are still open, most of it, right? Evolutionary theory, we have a lot of interesting developments. Natural selection is clearly a very powerful way of looking at how complexity generates, but at the end of the talk, I'm going to kind of see this can be challenged. And of course, there's many other things that are not yet solved, right? As those of you who work on origins of life, you know that we still try to fight about how to solve the problem, right? But there are many things, and most of them have to do with how major innovations happen in evolution, right? Because that implies something that requires new kinds of information, new ways of agency, new ways of individuality, right? And we are still working on how to manage this. And that connects with the ways in which we can approach this, and the things that are suggested by different branches of complexity, from statistical physics to information theory, which is, for example, is there order for free, meaning that are there complex structures that will appear in a system without natural selection, because it's just what fundamentally is possible. And I put here the synthetic biology story because I think that's an important point. Some years ago, I'm going to tell you the story how this originates. Some years ago, I organized this workshop at the Santa Fe Institute that ended up with a special issue in Philosophical Transactions, with the generic title of Major Synthetic Evolutionary Transitions, meaning that, of course, we cannot go back in time. You have a lot of very useful ways to approach how innovations might have happened, right? From molecular phylogenetics to some theories. But nowadays, it's a possibility actually in the lab to approach the major evolutionary transitions, trying to build them to happen then, right? That means from artificial life, that has a tradition, from synthetic biology, evolutionary robotics, so you can actually try to see if genetic properties of evolution can be found out. And I'm going to go for some of them, okay? All right, so this is my particular contribution, and one of the things that I argued here in this paper is that one of the natural languages to be used to approach these problems is the physics of phase transitions, because phase transitions in physics share a lot of things with the innovations, the nature of innovation in biology, right? And here, if you give a look to this, I tried to go from origins of life to language. So, prediction in biology. So what can be predicted? And that's a big issue, right? There's been a lot of discussion, a lot of controversy. One of the views of this, right, and I'm going to simplify a little bit, was provided by Stephen Jay Gould, in particular with his book, Wonderful Life. He uses the Cambrian explosion as kind of the case study, right? Because in the Cambrian explosion, you generate all the possible animal body plans that will be developing. Everything is invented there. Not only what we see here, but some particular kind of designs that never went through, right? And he kind of argues that what will happen if instead of some of those who were successful, others were successful, right? And the big point, to make the long story short, is evolution is highly historical, right? So it will depend strongly on what happened in the past. So the idea will be, because of that, right, from whatever is at some point in the system, there's many possibilities, right? It's kind of another demon here. Many possibilities that essentially depend on a lot on chance, all right? The Wonderful Life story comes from, inspired in the movie that you might have seen, right? It's a movie that is projected every single Christmas. I've seen it 30 times, I guess. Again, in a nutshell, the idea is this guy who's a very nice person, wants to help everyone, but at some point, everything went totally wrong, and he thinks in killing himself because he thinks that if I wasn't born, the world would be better, right? So an angel comes, which is a very annoying character, and that kind of insists, no, you're wrong. Well, okay, let's try, let's see, let's do the experiment, right? What will be the world if you haven't been born? And the thing is that he didn't save his little brother when he fell in a frozen lake, and so his brother couldn't save a company of soldiers in the world, Second World War, and so on and so forth. Everything, the world essentially is a shit because he wasn't born, right? That's the point. Well, is that so? Well, you can go into a different perspective, and one of the interesting things in biology that we see repeatedly is convergence. Many times in totally different lines independently, you see the same design principle emerging again and again, right? Our camera eye, for example, with the crystalline and the retina and everything, has been invented about 25 times independently, from us to octopi, and even there's a group of single-cell organisms in the sea, right, that have an eye inside, which is made with endosymbiotic bacteria that form a crystalline and retina, etc. Totally mental, right? Anyways, why is that, right? I give this example as very many examples. This is a book that I recommend, Life Solution. Sounds like a self-help book, but it's about convergence. It's about how many examples do you find out from molecules to brains or things that are repeatedly found out. I'm going to go through some of them. What this suggests, and Per Albert was kind of one of the big supporters of that, and my mentor in England, Brian Goodwin, also, it suggests that there very strong constraints into what actually can be built in systems, right? Maybe so strong that biology, in a way, is limited, right? I know this sounds disappointing, but wait. So there's another demon I want to point out. And actually, in a way, this is where all this story of this paper starts, right? My discussions with my mentor in the States, Stuart Kaufman, he has this view, which I think is a bit contradictory with some of the things he said in the past. But anyways, that, again, I'm kind of simplifying because otherwise I couldn't explain everything. The idea is that evolution works in a combinatorial space, essentially, where you invent the future, you construct new things from what is there, right, by combining, in a way or another, right, combining, transforming. So what he essentially says is this adjacent possible, the next step, the next thing that you can actually invent is essentially unpredictable. What can be there by combining other things? There's so many possibilities that he actually argues that it might not be possible to make a theory of evolution as a prediction system, as in physics, as we know from previous theories. Well, is that the case, right? Okay, so one inspiration for thinking outside what we see in the real world is from science fiction. I don't know how many of you are sci-fi readers. I've read a lot of that, okay? And of course, there's many ways in which you can think in potential alternatives for life, right? From a cloud, a gas cloud that is alive. Don't believe that at all, right? A planet that is alive and cognitive, or this nice story, The Invincible, where you have a planet where you have a kind of crystal-like of organization, right? That well, I don't want to make spoilers here. Anyways, so how I'm going to approach this to try to convince you that at the level of the logic, the fundamental logic, there are things that are totally inevitable, right? Well, we want to look for universals. In physics, the idea of universal is one of the strongest ones. Well, we know and we have a theory for understanding why so many different systems can be explained by the same theory, right? The same theoretical framework. Information theory, although I'm not going to touch much, evidence from artificial life models, constraints from designs. And one of the things that is peculiar about the paper, and what I'm going to say, but I think that some of you will appreciate, is the vision of the people who foresee the fundamental laws that are going to be discovered, right? I'll show you the examples, right? First thing, information molecules. Have in mind that I'm talking about early origins of structures, so the basic fundamental things, okay? How to get into some things, I don't know, right? The argument is whether, for example, linear polymers as carriers of information that can be read, right, are an inevitable part of life, right? And what are the consequences of this, okay? So if I tell you, if I ask you, tell me how will you think in some kind of molecular way of storing information, right? That can be read, right? And I want to make a point here because you can have information in a way. Imagine, for example, you take the 3 rings in a tree, right? The 3 rings are there. We can read that. We can look and see, well, that year there was cold, it was raining, but this information is totally unavailable to the plant, right? It's totally useless. So information has to be stored and has to be possible to read and write. So if any of you come from computer science, is anyone from computer science? The typical picture is the Turing machine, right? A tape, okay, with ones and zeros, of course, and some system, right? Here a machine that can read, right, and change state and write, and amazingly, from this you can actually make a whole theory of computation, right? Everything can be captured from this. Interestingly, Turing formulated this idea, right, in a very, very, very abstract way. Isn't it interesting that inside cells, that's a lot of what we see about information, right? Tapes, right? Linear molecules. that are read by molecular machines. Okay? Well, let me give you some insight from these two people who kind of thought about this basis of molecular information in biology and pretty much nailed down. One was Erwin Schrödinger, right? He had this little book, again, a modest title, What is Life? That had a lot of influence in many ways. At some point, he made this kind of basic experimental thought in thinking of what kind of molecules should we expect to be able to store information. And he said whatever it is has to be an aperiodic crystal, right? Not bad, because DNA in the end is a regular structure, right? Double helix, clearly recognizable, but it has to contain aperiodicity, something that allows for heterogeneity, because otherwise you cannot store information, right? Okay, everybody knows about, well, everybody. Most people knows about that. Anybody heard about Nikolai Koltsov? No? No, what the heck?
From your paper.
From my paper, yeah. But that's a trick. So, interestingly, Nikolai Koltsov was completely forgotten. Years ahead, Erwin Schrödinger, I think in 1927, he was studying the chromatin. He was trying to figure out, what is the basis of heritable information, right? And somewhere he writes, whatever it is, it has to be giant linear molecules that complement each other and replicate by semi-conservative replication. What the hell? Hats off, is it? It's exactly how DNA works, right? Unfortunately, he wrote in Russian, right? He was translated, but he didn't get much further. And of course, he was living in the Stalin time, and he was eventually poisoned. Killing Oak in a career. Yeah. It's a whole story. I'm simplifying, but it's very unfortunate. So my point is, are linear polymers something that have to be considered fundamentally necessary? Yeah, at some critical point in the history of life, all right? Well, have in mind one thing. We'll go into that again. If you are in a linear system, and a machine has to read the polymer, right? It has not much choices. You have to move through the polymer, right? So there's a very helpful thing to actually be reliable. Another important thing is that, and again I'm simplifying the story, is that there's something essentially revolutionary with the emergence of polymers, which is interesting that is not captured by physics in a way, which is that as soon as you have polymers, you have a combinatorial space, which rapidly, super exponentially expands, right? That's not something that is a concept of physics, so that's why I'm saying, to develop the theories that I think are necessary, we have to combine ideas from different areas, right? But it's revolutionary. You have this space, which is going to be relevant if evolution is in place, right? As soon as you can start to select and take advantage of the landscape that is there, this is going to be a real revolution, right? I recommend this paper by my former student, Susana Manrubia, where she actually looks into these combinatorial spaces. But you might say, yes, but what about maybe a two-dimensional system, okay? Not a linear chain, but maybe a surface where you can actually also, in a way, read in some reliable way. Well, that's something we are exploring. Is this something that is even feasible? Right? If you think for a moment, you want to read this information, whatever it is. Of course, mathematicians have done theoretical work on Turing machines, on two-dimensional tapes, or three-dimensional. Mathematicians are totally crazy. Is there any mathematician here? Right. So, but that's a different story. The thing is, you have a surface, a substrate, that you have to exploit as in a systematic way. Is very highly non-trivial to think in any molecular machine that can read that, all right? And there have been interesting attempts to actually build on surfaces heterogeneous kind of polymers, right, attached to surfaces. But again, it's a problem of, okay, I can count here the heterogeneity and say the entropy is this and that. Yeah, but how do you read that? How do you make this really useful for anything, or right, even for natural selection? Nevertheless, there's a lot of interesting things there. So there's a conjecture and a very important point I want to make. The conjecture will be like molecular information, which allows storage and processing, so it can be read, right? Requires necessarily linear polymers. We are working on that with a couple of colleagues at the Santa Fe Institute in trying to see if we can actually see that this constraint comes from thermodynamic costs and also the genetic code, right? But again, work in progress. One interesting implication of this, right? I was discussing this with Kepa and several chemists, is the following. If you want to build a linear polymer, right, you need units. Units have to be heterogeneous because a homogeneous polymer is like a hydrocarbon, which is irrelevant for us. It has to be heterogeneous, which means that every unit has to connect with two neighbors, right? In a way that the energies are similar. So this is something that Paty was actually conjecturing. What are the candidates for that, right? Not too many, right? So it actually goes down into nucleotides and the similar things, right? And you ask, I've been asking chemists, so what is, because this vast space of possibilities in chemistry suggests that maybe there are other things. Where are they, right? All right, let's go into the different level, cells. We know that life, as we know, it's organized in discrete units. Those are really the fundamental units of life, as far as we know, right? And either as free forms or as being part of a multicellular organism. All right, why cells? Why not something else? Is it possible to think in an alternative biosphere or a design system where life in a way maintains this robust kind of agency without having agents that are based on cells, right? Of course, cells are a fantastic thing. As soon as you have a compartment that defines an inside and an outside, this is again a kind of a revolution, right? Because you distinguish yourself from the environment, and if the membrane allows for flows, you can actually build things out of equilibrium, store information, and do a lot of things, right? Which we've been thinking about that in different terms. What about life that is not based on closed membranes, but instead is in soft matter of a different kind? It's not obvious at all that there's an alternative. Anyways, John von Neumann, who was kind of the last Renaissance mathematician, at the end of his life, he was thinking in very interesting stuff. And for example, inspired in brains, how I will build a computer that is reliable, made of unreliable parts, like the brain. Or how a machine replicates itself. Right? Many of us think that if Turing and von Neumann had not died so soon, maybe nowadays with complex systems will be in the universities like the most important thing. Anyways, he was thinking about that, a mathematician, right? Years ahead, molecular biology, DNA, polymerases, regulatory systems, everything. We didn't know anything at that time, right? So he was thinking about, okay, how can I build a machine able to do that, right? This is a whole story for a whole seminar. But to make the long story short, again, the thing that he stumbled out is that whatever it is, it has to be a system able to contain a set of instructions, right? This set of instructions have a dual role. So in a way, using other parts, like what he called a duplicator, that has to make copies, right? A controller, a constructor. These instructions have to drive the replication process, right? You need an instruction for that. But also at the end, it has to be like hardware, has to be copied physically, all right? Okay, for most people, this is kind of familiar, because in the end, isn't it what cells exactly do? The DNA, which acts in these two ways. And again, I'm talking about information in thinking very early stages, right? Cells unfold information, the modern sense, in many other ways, okay? So, interestingly, you showed this to a biologist, he will say, yes, what you're showing me is how a cell works and how a cell replicates. Not bad at all. If you want to go into previous stuff, one of my co-authors argued that, well, there was someone who already said that a Turing machine can make copies of themselves, right? The problem is that you go into the paper, which is the second recursive theorem, blah, blah, blah. It's a totally obscure mathematical paper. And von Neumann said many other things. I want to point out that, of course, how do you prove that this is the way in which you can build the basic building blocks from which evolution is capable of doing many other things, right? There's many problems around that need to be actually solved. Things that have to do, for example, with the way in which biology builds things. It exploits soft matter in active ways, right? Soft matter has properties of self-organization, which don't require a program, actually, to kind of guide. They can actually react in completely autonomous ways. But there's plenty of things that have to be solved, and we actually explored this problem with Harold Fellerman and some colleagues about how cells replicate. And I want to point out, this is more for the physicists, but that one of the missing points we have in our theories is to have a theory of the thermodynamic cycle of cells when they replicate. We don't have that, really. So, sorry, this is being compressed when I transform into PowerPoint. The conjecture is that cells are probably the fundamental units of life, inevitably, right? For many, many reasons that come from the logic to the possible, right? How do you make an agent that is, in a way captured within a given finite domain of space? Vesicles are kind of automatic possibilities, except that it's very easy to generate closed structures from soft matter, as you know, when you make bubbles, for example. But to make them grow and destabilize is something that happens all the time, but we still miss the theoretical part. Okay. So I'm jumping. In the middle of this, there's development, right, which is a lot. I still didn't manage how to explain what we present there in a few minutes, so I skip it, but we can talk about that, right? Cognition, which of course is a huge story, right? Cognition is very important for many reasons. I mean, also in evolution, probably in the Cambrian, the agents that emerged there, prior to that, they were single cells, were probably had capacities for learning and memory, anticipation, limited, probably very limited. But nevertheless, at the Cambrian, the part of the revolution is that predators emerge, and predators push evolution and accelerate. As soon as predators emerge, you have to develop senses, move in space, right, and do all kinds of things. There's this paper by John Hophill, which some of you might heard about. He got the Nobel Prize in physics, the last one, working on things that is not the standard kind of physics. In this paper, he argues that, in fact, if you look at physical systems compared with biological systems, the big distinction comes from computation. Computation in a very general sense. Biological entities sense their environments, change their internal states in response, right, and perform some action, which you can actually map into computations. Well, again, if you look at natural systems, because again, if you want, we can look at this whole talk about these universals, also looking at what is not there, right? Why so many things we can imagine are not there? We don't have ants with big brains. We don't. The brains themselves have this architecture that is, bilateral with these two hemispheres. Why not something like this? Why not some homogeneous stuff? Okay? All right, some of the answers in the afternoon. So, I don't want to make spoilers.
It's there, right? It's there. It's announced there in the...
Okay, all right. So, also at the Santa Fe Institute, I organized this workshop with two of my colleagues on, we call liquid brains, right? So, what is the space of the possible? But again, this is a whole story. And one particular thing. One of the things that have to do with what just mentioned before about the units of life is the units of cognition, right? When you look at neural agents, right, that are equipped with some fundamental units that have this amazing structure. Sometimes we don't pay as much attention as you should. When you look at cell types from the liver or the gut or wherever it is, often looking at their structure, you can actually infer what they might be doing, right? secreting molecules or whatever. if you look at neurons, how interesting is that, right? A hyper-branched structure. Why? What they are trying to look for? Information, right? This is information-driven structures. And they have this architecture that is, again, is universal, right? Take, for example, octopi. We develop invertebrates, neurons that became multi-layers, right? And a lot of things happen. And there's a parallel branch, but totally independent on invertebrates, where you end up with organisms that have neurons, right? Multi-layers, and brains. And these elements work in a very simplified way, work as follows. You have a number of inputs, right, from other neurons that send signals, right? This information goes in one direction, so it's a polar system, and it works essentially by thresholds, right? In my total information coming from, or total signal coming from my inputs, I make I fire, right? And I send a signal to many other neurons, right? The scale, of course, is huge. Why polar linear systems? Why is that? Could it be an alternative for that? And how do we guide this into try to answer? Well, on one hand, there's things that we see repeatedly, right? When we model gene regulatory networks, right, the models we use are essentially neural network models, right? Where you have genes that receive activation or inhibition from other what we call transcription factors, right? And this is integrated here. And interestingly, when we model the way in which this works, is precisely the one that we use originally to model neurons, right? I send signals from my different neighbors through these weights, right? I integrate and then decide. And this basic structure, which comes from McCulloch and Pitts, right? So the 50s, is exactly the same thing that's been applied for ChatGPT or everything else, right? It keeps being there. So it's an interesting observation that polarity and threshold behavior seems to be something that is again and again universally used. Why not something else, right? That's something else that we are trying to figure out using an evolutionary model. And as I was saying, it's an interesting question nowadays because the possible and the actual, right? We know we have this multi-layered architecture in brain cortex, right? And this architecture was used as inspiration for early days of artificial intelligence with neural networks, right? To build the first neural networks, like the perception, that in a way kind of exploit what we think happens in the brain, right? All these large language models and everything that is going on right now actually is the grandsons of all this, right? We keep repeating this. But why multi-layers? Is there an alternative to that? And if you want, as a speculation, again, kind of a speculation, a parenthesis here, what the potential universals that we need to actually have a complex brain? We know what I mean, the big components. How this can affect our potential for designing artificial intelligences, right? Again, some answers in the afternoon, right? This paper that I did with one of my former students, Luis Seoane, ends up in an attempt to actually see if we try to make a general theory and see, for example, how you put cognitions, all cognitions, right? That's the kind of the dream we have with this liquid brain workshop, together in a single space, right? Putting, for example, as access to what extent collective interactions or culture, if you want, are relevant, what will be the weight of computational complexity, how complex is cognition, and something else, autonomy here. So you can put together a space where you have biological systems. I know I put the humans there. Somebody could say, wow, humans. But I can defend very well why humans are there, right? We are singular species, for sure. And whereas everything artificial is still here in this kind of place with a big gap, right? So this space is still empty. And there's a good reason for that. Anyways, so conjectures. One is that cognitive agents necessarily will carry out polar threshold elements. We are working on that and trying to see if using a model that evolves cells that initially have no polarity nor threshold behavior but have to solve a problem. Whether this is in the end, we discovered that the only potential possibility is that you evolve cells that are threshold and are polar, right? I can make a spoiler that everything seems to suggest that that's the case, right? And well, this has consequences for everything else that can come out afterwards. But from polar systems, threshold systems, you can very easily go into multi-layers, right? And the power of multi-layers is just amazing, as we know. Another jump, you could say ecosystems. Come on, I mean, ecosystems seem to be a very diverse thing. What kind of universals can be there, right? Particularly in terms of the logic. Well, ecosystems, of course, are extremely diverse, and one of the legitimate questions that you can actually ask yourself is, why are ecosystems so complex, right? Why not a biosphere with bacteria, right? They replicate fast, they go on very well. They actually still there dominating a lot of the scene. So why complexity at all, right? But that's a question we can discuss. So you can recognize in ecosystems easily kind of the logic in terms of what is the trophic role played by the given species, right? So a field ecologist go to a given place and can say, okay, look, this is a predator, this is prey, this is symbiont, this is parasites, etc., right? But this etc. is a finite collection, right? Is not a long collection. You can actually collapse this into a 3x3 matrix, essentially, right? And the recognition of this can go even to paleo food webs, right? Well, now we have a lot of data available for understanding who interacts with whom. You can actually build the networks that involve different trophic species and pretty much be able to reconstruct the community structure, all right? So I talked before about Koltsov and von Neumann. So what is the visionary here, the precursor of that? Right? Was Niels Barricelli, right? Which I guess you have heard, and Arantxa, but not so many people. And the reason is that Barricelli was a pioneer in something that became at some point mainstream within artificial life, which is simulating ecosystems, right? But it was in the 50s. So he convinced von Neumann that actually he had a great idea. He was very interested in proving that it's possible to make a theory of how symbiogenesis evolves. And he wanted to do it in silico, make a digital ecology, which is pretty much a vision. So he was allowed to use these first computers, right, with vacuum tubes and all that stuff, using time at night. Right? Over the day, they were computing how to make atomic bombs and things like that, right? And at night, it was used for exploring life. And so he ended up with two interesting things. Again, it's a long story, right? But he ended up seeing that it was possible in his one-dimensional world. Is one dimension of space, if you want, and this is time, right? And you have these very peculiarly defined agents, right, which can interact with each other. You can have kind of mutations, etc. And you do observe that at some point there's cooperative behavior emerging in the system. But one thing that he also found out, right, is that an inevitable thing that seemed to be emerging all the time is parasites. So if you want, viruses. Parasites are something that is pretty much universal, and they fuck up everything, right? So eventually, the system easily collapsed, right? So he had to kind of put that under control, right? And since he was like God, he could actually do that. And the modern version of that, which comes from the late 80s and early 90s, was from Tom Ray, who he's a field ecologist, so he's not suspicious of anything. And at some point, he was very, very interested about the problem of, again, why nature is so diverse and why the diversity observed is made of all kinds of entities that is unrecognizable. So he did something that was pretty much visionary, of course, on the steps of Botticelli, which was take the laptop and again explain it very quickly. He starts with a bunch of programs, identical programs, this code machine, because to make this efficient at that time. They are going to compete for the memory of the system, right? So the idea is I have these programs. Every single round, they are going to replicate or try to, okay? The population has to be constant, so it's finite resources. And they can mutate. So some pieces of code can actually be wrong, if you want. So what happened? He didn't expect much to happen, really. But the first thing that happened is that after a while, there was this group of programs that replicated faster. They were mutants. And since he could see everything, what he realized was these programs were shorter, right? It makes sense. The shorter you are, the less you require, the fastest you are, right? After a while, there were these other programs that were shorter, right? But he found out that they couldn't replicate by themselves, right? They were using code from other programs to make copies. So you have parasites, right? After a while, there were parasites of the parasites, what we call hyperparasites, and you find out in nature. After a while, some of the programs discovered something very important, which is that if you want to escape from parasites have been very important in evolution to push complexity. You want to escape, one thing you can do is scramble your code, right? So recombine with other codes. Because in this way, you might be still functional, right? But the parasite, when it tries to recognize code, he will not be able to, or less efficient. So that's what we call two ways of saying that. One is, if you want, recombination. The funny word is sex, okay? And after a while, what happened is that there was some sets of codes, sets of programs, that none of them was very efficient in replicating itself, but collectively, they were more efficient. So cooperation emerged. Hey, not bad, right? This is not real life. There's no living matter. There's no an ecosystem with light and energy, etc. It's pretty much digital. But amazingly, it seems to capture the fundamental things that we see in the real world, right? Parasites, hyperparasites, sex, cooperation, right? They could not jump into multicellularity because for constraints of the way it's defined, right? But it kind of recapitulates a lot of what we see in the real world. And for me, it's like a first answer to Gould's conjecture. If I do that again and again, is the tape of evolution show me a totally alien, unrecognizable world? The point is, in terms of the logic, of the kind of structures you observe, it's not, it's universal. So the biosphere that will re-emerge, if we're able to go back in time and see it again, will be different, but familiar, clearly familiar, all right? So the logic is the same. There's a lot of stuff that has been done by Walter Fontana and ourselves. Just to want to mention, if you want to look at this paper, interestingly, when you put your evolving systems in a context that is physical, right, embodiment itself is capable of pushing complexity a lot. Right? The existence of space, and you are in space, right? And that has a lot of implications for astrobiology, et cetera, et cetera. So, just packing up things. Parasites in artificial life have been recognized that you can run simulations of diversification of a complex ecosystem. If you forbid parasites, the potential for innovations is clearly reduced, right? If you put parasites, they push coevolutionary innovation. In our picture in this paper, we said, well, if you look at how our life evolves in silico or in reality, you could think in a space of possible ways in which you can be part of an ecosystem, again, a predator, a prey, a symbiont, whatever. But this is a discrete set. If you start from somewhere, right, and everyone is, for example, just a replicator, you will evolve. Eventually, this is going to branch, but my branches are defined in terms, where do I classify you, right? What kind of organism are you? We put these thick ones here, right? Because one of the things that seems to be, and that's one of the big points of what I'm saying, is that parasites are inevitable, right? That's something that is all the time happening. We know from experience. Every single organism on the planet has a parasite or a virus, right? Even in society, we see some of this. There's attempts to actually make a theory. Why is that? It seems so obvious, but I think it's obvious. It doesn't mean that we understand, right? And we ourselves have been looking at that in terms of kind of going into the fundamental way in which you can define a parasite. But the conjectures at this level, right, is that the possible organization of ecosystems, wherever you find them, right, will recapitulate the logic of what we see, the kind of basic interactions that you can actually define. It's a whole extra argument that you find out in the paper. And one of the legs of here that I would love to be able to prove, right, is that parasites are inevitable with all the consequences that this has, right? Again, we are in the level of the logic of how this works. And last point. Last point has to do with the underlying theory that is most of the time in our minds when we think on anything that is here, is natural selection, right? Natural selection as the driving dynamical force for evolution. So is this the law? Is this the law that can generate complexity? In other words, could I think maybe speculation, right? Imagine there's another planet where structures, which could be closed vesicles that are able to self-maintain themselves but do not replicate, right? Could it be possible to have a different context, a different way in which I can generate complexity as part of an evolutionary process, not based on natural selection, right? It's been speculation on that, and we are trying also to figure out how to approach this in thinking that maybe right at the beginning, before life as we know and natural selection started to work, it might have been other things, what some people call pre-evolutionary dynamics, right? The things that are not natural selection. But again, this is something that we need to prove, right? And we need because, we are so familiar with natural selection that maybe we are blind into other potential mathematical ways into how to formulate that. I like this sentence by Leonard Susskind. He's a theoretical physicist. Has these amazing lectures on physics that I very much recommend. In one of his books, he makes this statement: modern cosmology begins with Darwin and Wallace. He's thinking in that even in cosmology, which is about how the universe originates and develops, right, across several phase transitions also, right, we need to think in terms of, right, how things evolve in time, right? And without that, we don't have a theoretical framework. So in this particular place, after a lot of discussion, but again, this is something that needs to be formalized, right? We do think that natural selection is the most powerful force, and that if we formulate the right theory, you could see how natural selection itself emerges, right? That's the thing that has to be shown, right? But we think that this is based on replicators, right? Probably the linear replicators. So I know what you're thinking. Okay, so if everything is so predictable and there's no space for surprise, and when the aliens come, it will be like us, maybe? No. But of course, it is. We have been talking about the logic, right? There's one thing called phenotypic plasticity, which is the way in which evolution unfolds in terms of forms in absolutely amazing ways, right? I was recently in a talk with, just to give you one example, of a guy who is studying bats in a place of Asia, and he was kind of charting the phenotypic diversity of heads, right? And because they have to adapt to very different conditions, you have bats with a big nose, like Pinocchio, bats with a totally flat head face, like it was kind of a joke, really. And so it's all the diversity you can imagine. Phenotypes can unfold in many, many ways, right? But let's not lose our sight here. Autopy, for example, are these amazing creatures with complex cognition, an embodiment that is really alien, right? In a way, okay? Because all these the brain plus the 8 kind of mini brains for each leg, right? So it's really different. But the eyes are like ours. They have neurons like ours. They have brains that pretty much are like ours. Even the behavioral patterns are very easy to recognize. Right? It's totally universal. Learning, associative learning, a lot of things that they do, we are very familiar with that. That's why we like octopi, right? Okay? I don't know if you have heard about that, but I have these colleagues in Barcelona, they have octopi, and they have seen this thing. It's a general observation. Since you have cameras, at night, some of them just jump out the fish tank, go to another fish tank, right? I guess to visit someone. And for whatever reason, before the daylight, they are back, right? What the hell is that, right? Okay. So unfortunately, they live only a couple of years. So there's probably a lot of potential cognitive complexity that is lost because they learn a lot, really, over their lifetimes. So there's, again, a very interesting paper where there's this comparison between vertebrate brains, octopi brain, and despite the apparent alien structure, there's an amazing amount of commonalities here, right? So we end up the paper like this, right? If the constraints are universal, as I was saying before, our conjecture is that life elsewhere, the life we can build in the lab, now that bioengineering is becoming kind of a more powerful tool, is going to be limited by the logic. It's going to be universal. It's going to be familiar. So it's what we know, right? So all this has been done over the years. I mean, this paper for me is kind of a encapsulation of my 30 years career within complex systems, right? I've been amazed. Sometimes people tell me, how you do so many things? Because I'm surrounded with very bright, enthusiastic people, right? You take the right people, give freedom, and good questions, it works, right? So a lot of interesting people. And this is my first lab, my first complex system lab. It's a really funny story about how it started. It could have completely failed. But anyways, it's interesting that after 30 years, many of the questions that are in this paper, the roots are in our conversations by that time. And I think that, that's all. Thank you.
Thanks, Ricard, for a wonderful talk.